I'm your host, Melvin Burris, and today our guest is William S. Greenwalt.
Yes, sir.
Attorney at law. I'm your host, Melvin Burris, and today we're going to be talking about current legal issues and what you need to know to protect yourself. But before we get into it, first, Counselor, will you tell the audience a bit about yourself?
Sure. I was born and raised in Westchester Public Schools, went to Cornell up in Ithaca, then Navy, 2 years in the Navy, and then to Yale Law School. Graduated, went to private practice in New York City with a very large and well-known law firm. But I left after 4 years to go into the war on poverty with the Office of Economic Opportunity under Sergeant Shriver. And I got into the setting up of the legal services programs for the poor throughout New England, New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and set up 75 programs, which was a third of all those in the country. There were 9 regions, so I really knocked myself out. And the current legal services programs, which are now funded through the Legal Services Corporation instead of the Office of Economic Opportunity, those are all my creations, and they're doing a great job, including the Hudson Legal Services of the Hudson Valley here in Westchester, which services the counties up and down the Hudson River.
Okay, let's go back then. And you say you left a large law firm back in 1965. I remember that well because I went to Vietnam at that time.
Oh.
So I know it well. But what was the basis of setting these up? What was the what study was done that says we need legal services for the poor?
There were all sorts of studies that were done by universities, by people in various institutions. The germ of it probably was as much in New York City as anywhere else. Mobilization for Youth, you may remember that name. The Legal Aid Society, which began in New York City, was a very big supplier of legal services for the poor, but there weren't enough of those throughout the United States. And also the private bar, the lawyers in private practice, did not give enough legal services to the poor. The poor still needed a tremendous amount of legal services, and they couldn't afford them. So the federal government took the initiative, and under Johnson, President Johnson, the war on poverty came just after the Peace Corps, and the Anti-Poverty Corps was set up to supply governmental funded, largely governmental funded, some state, some local, and some private contributions through public government employees all over the country to service the poor. They really needed a great deal of legal help.
Okay, so we're looking now. What was the state of the legal services for the poor in the criminal defense and civil defense?
There was criminal defense through the public defender, and most legal aid societies did criminal work. Some did civil work as well. But the civil legal services for the poor were very poorly administered. There simply were not nearly enough of them, so that we had such areas as evictions, family law problems, some things like Social Security, additional funds if you were injured, problems of mortgages, problems of rent, all sorts of problems the poor get into, sufficient food through food stamps, things like this that rich people simply don't have to worry about.
And so you think it's the role of the government to have what we call a safety net for those before they slip through?
I do. I feel that here is an area which, to me, another one is medical care for the poor, that we all should be able to get medical care that we need in the United States, and we're largely on our way to that. And I think that's a good thing. The second thing that's most important to people, however, I think is a way to establish their rights and protect themselves. And I believe that the poor should have just as much ability to do that as the rich.
Now, what was some of the results of your efforts, I might say?
Well, we had no government-funded legal services programs at that point. When I began, I set up 75 programs in the Northeast, New York, New Jersey, and down to Puerto Rico. And that was a third of all the programs in the country at that time. There were 9 regions, and I got a special promotion for the work that I did put in on that. It was a labor of love. I worked day and night setting up these programs, going to all the places, talking with the local community action workers and people, individuals, the poor themselves. And by the way, there's a requirement that some poor people, actually poor people, are on every board of directors of every legal services program in the United States.
What was the theme that ran through all the different regions and locales?
Well, there was a theme which, sad to say in a way, but it worked out well, a kind of tension between the established bar associations and the lawyers in an area and the government. Sometimes the local government was sympathetic to the federal government's program, sometimes it wasn't. But the local lawyers, many of them, wanted to be paid on what they called judicare, which was that the federal government would fund local lawyers for hours of service to the poor. But that wouldn't have gone nearly as far. It goes much, much farther, the service, with full-time lawyers dedicated and knowledgeable about the services that they'll provide. So every program was a struggle. And
well, the lawyers felt that local bar felt you were taking business away from them in some sort of funny way.
Yes.
If some people could pay for legal
They
service.
did feel that way. It's turned out not to be so much that way, and there are some programs that do have a feature where they do fund local lawyers in part. We had to sort of custom make each program in each area, but the basic backbone of the program is full-time lawyers dedicated to this work only.
So how did it change legal services in the United States at that time? Well, I should say this region.
Well, it changed a great deal. This became the backbone and the main delivery service for legal services to the poor, and the amount of legal services which the poor were able to receive jumped many, many hundreds of times over what it had been before. Now the programs are not fully funded. They're not adequately funded. And the Hudson Valley program now was originally just in Westchester and Putnam, but now it's expanded up into Dutchess and Columbia, Rockland, and so on. But we did have these programs, and there were some 225 programs all over the United States.
You said in the beginning was that these programs weren't funded at the time.
Yes.
Okay, so what kind of mechanism that you get into for funding?
Well, the Congress and the President would appropriate funds for the, at that time, it was the Office of Economic Opportunity, Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, with Sergeant Shriver as the director. And legal services was then one of the components. You may recognize some of the other components were Head Start. They had jobs creation through other programs. There were community action programs, many of which still continue today. But then the Legal Services Corporation, as sort of a protection to itself, the Legal Services Corporation was formed and was an independent way of getting funding. I might say the American Bar Association was behind this program, and that was a very, very important because that was the most important bar association in the country.
Okay. Now, we have the pro se.
Yes.
Attorneys who works without pay. Why wasn't this kind of a mechanism to do the work rather than having paid attorneys? Did you look at pro ses or attorneys volunteering their time
Well, yeah, attorneys do volunteer their time to help people, and pro se would be a way in which an individual might represent himself without an attorney.
Right, rather
but
attorney, right.
Many attorneys, like for example in my practice right now, I'm handling a great number of cases and matters for poor people on a
Pro bono, that's
non-pay basis.
Pro bono. Is
Pro
what I'm
bono,
referring-
yeah, on a
right,
pro
right.
bono basis.
Was pro bono part of this program that you started?
No, they do try. Every program tries to enlist the services of individual attorneys to help out and enlarge the network of the paid attorneys. So they reach out for that. Some are more successful than others. I'm not right now part of any program, but I do render on my own a lot of pro bono services.
And so how is the funding now going for the legal services?
It's still inadequate. It's not adequate. They could take twice as much or 3 times as much funding as they have and still not meet the needs of all the poor. I mean, they're better taken care of in places where there was a reception to this program or where the program was put through. And some places in the United States, there are no such programs still. In certain states, in certain counties, they don't have the kind of services that we have in the Hudson Valley.
So what would you leave with our audience about the legal services? What would you want them to remember or know?
Well, I would say the role of government in these debates recently in the presidential debates, Republican debates, and in the State of the Union address last night, the question of what is the role of government in these in the United States and for people. In my view, it's clear from the experience before and after that government has to be involved in supplying these services. And it's important as the medical services are for people to have equal rights and to feel that their rights are being taken care of. And I think government is essential in supplying and furnishing those rights to people.
Okay. Now, tell us some of the other areas of law that you've practiced in.
Well, I've practiced in election law. I have a specialty in election law, handled quite a number of those. And I've also done a lot of commercial transactions. I've done some negligence law. And right now in the area I'm talking about, I've done some support cases. I've done some matrimonial cases involving, say, name changes where one parent of a divorced child, parents have divorced, one parent wants the child named after its new husband, last name, the other one wants its name kept. That's one I tried up in Rochester and won on that one for the husband who wanted the name kept of a 5-year-old child.
Okay.
Evictions, I've handled a lot of matters involving evictions.
Okay, let's talk about voting rights. Right now, there's an assault, I should say, on voting rights, restricting voting rights in some parts of the country. South Carolina comes to mind right off, based on the criteria now that they're using for eligibility, photos and things like that. Could you just expound on some of that for a minute?
Yes, I think it's really shocking and appalling that at this time in our country's history, with the Voting Rights Act, with the progress that was being made in getting all of our citizens able to vote and cutting away restrictions like the poll tax and other restrictive things like this, that we're back now at the point where some of our states are putting on additional requirements which will undoubtedly have are intended to and probably will have the result of cutting down the number of people that exercise their right to vote. I think that's the clear impact of these restrictions. One state, for example, even a veteran's card showing that a person is a veteran is not enough of an ID to entitle him to vote. Some people have to go and get entirely new registration cards, entirely new identification cards. In our own area here of Rockland, we just saw have a situation where there's been close play at the polls themselves. When people come out to vote, people could question them or intimidate them in some way from voting. That's not an official state policy, of course. But these state policies, I hope, will be challenged either in lawsuits, which I think the Supreme Court of the United States will hear, and knocked down as too much encroachment on the right to vote.
Okay, I guess there's two parts of this. One is voter ID or identification, and the other is voter technology or voting machine technology. Now, what is the why do you think this restriction and confusion with the ID is coming into play at this point?
I think it's an effort to intimidate or put an extra requirement on voters, potential voters, to keep them from registering or to keep them from voting because they have to go through extra steps. I mean, I think the right policy, the direction we should be going in, it seems to me, is to have like pre-primary or pre-election day registration and voting to give people the maximum chance to vote, and to give people who are absent, unavoidably absent from their polls that day, proper treatment on absentee ballots, to give them, proper voting rights and equal voting rights. I think we want to maximize the number of people who vote. And our country, United States, is way, way down on the list of, in terms of percentage of people in the country that vote. It's appalling. It's something like 33%, whereas many countries are up around 80, 70.
Okay. The other quick, we talked briefly, and you mentioned that there are some cases before the United States Supreme Court. Could you touch on what cases are there and the implications of those cases?
Well, another thing that's being done is the question of redistricting, and some maps that have been drawn in a state like, for example, Texas, are now are being ruled on by the Supreme Court as to whether they meet the requirements of the Voting Rights Act and other legislation, or they don't. And if those, if there's too much of an effort, it appears, to, for example, cut out minority voters, cut out African American voters, or Latino voters, which is both groups are in Texas, and the Latino influence is very heavy in Texas. If there's an effort at that, then they may strike that down and say, go back to the drawing board and try again. You're not meeting the requirements. We have to do redistricting here in New York too, and we have to watch what we're doing, although I don't think that kind of problem will come up in New York.
Now it's more or less solidifying the parties rather than...
Right, it's a party matter in New York, I think.
What can people do? What can the average person do about some of these things? I mean, you've seen injustice, as you were saying, injustice done in parts of the country, and the restrictions of voting and things like that. What do you think the average person can do about that?
That's a very good question. It's difficult. It's difficult for the average person to really think that he might be able to change things, but I nonetheless think that it can be done. In many states there is a petition process or referendum process by which you can, if you collect enough signatures, and it has to be a lot of signatures, you can get a statewide referendum on an issue, and you can undo some of these damaging things that have been done. You can also hire an attorney, or an attorney can, take it pro bono to challenge some of these things that have been done in court. And indeed, there are all these things that go against voting rights that have been enacted in states are under challenge in court right now. And they're eventually going to find their way, I believe, to the Supreme Court of the United States. Another thing you can do is, of course, elect different representatives if you don't think your representatives are doing the right thing by you.
Okay. You mentioned before that you had some cases in voting, some voting election cases. Can you tell the audience what some of those cases were about and how you handled it and what was the implications of it?
Yes. I have handled a lot of cases on voting rights in Westchester County in particular. And they involve situations where signatures have come under challenge, or a person has claimed. In one case that I had, a federal case involving Mount Vernon, one candidate, who I won't name, said that he thought that the election a few years ago was a federal violation, that there were federal violations, and his civil rights had been abridged. I handled that for the other side of that case, and it turned out that I won the case, and there was no civil rights violation. Other cases involve people, for example, where signatures are questioned or voters are questioned, and they have to get on the stand and testify that, yes, that's my signature, or I'm the person that came to the polls, and also the questions of this. I didn't actually handle this case that was involved in Rockland about challenges at the line where people were waiting in line to vote, but there were statements of intimidation on both sides.
Do you see anything coming with the voter technology? They're going from the punch to card to...
Yeah, I think it remains to be seen if the new machines, or the paper ballots, are a good thing or not. There's been some complaints about privacy, but I don't think the privacy aspect is the main thing. I think the main thing is the reliability and how this system is going to work out. It's the system we had in New York for a long time. It's too bad that people didn't keep on making parts for the machines because they got a little outdated. But here we are, back to paper ballots. We'll have to see how they work out. They're just really in their infancy here in the state, and we have also interpreters now at our polling places, Spanish, and we have special machines for the blind or the hard of seeing or the hard of the hard of hearing is not a problem at the polling places.
Right,
but
yeah, it seems like we're trying to do more to get people out, and yet in some areas we're restricting getting people out. So, I guess it depends on where you're at, right?
Yeah, and it depends on what efforts are made.
What states you're in.
What states are in, I think, is extremely important. But what I'm thinking of in terms of getting more people out, I noticed that the South Carolina primary was held on a Saturday, which is an interesting idea. Some people didn't like it, but maybe people have a little more leisure time on Saturday to get out and vote. Now, there's another state that encourages pre-primary or pre-election voting,
right?
And you can send in your vote.
I think
your actual
Florida's
vote.
doing that, isn't
What's
it?
that?
Florida's doing
I believe so, and I think one of the possibly Wisconsin or some other state may be doing that. Now it seems to me that's a good thing to be done.
Now, one thing is, you mentioned earlier, you ran for Congress.
Yes.
What was your platform? What kind of change were you looking to do?
Well, it was some time ago, and I ran against a fellow who had been in Congress for 4 years, came in on Nixon's coattails. So he was a Republican. Now, he's since changed his affiliation after I ran against him to Democratic, and he's has served well. He was a moderate Republican, but we still differed on quite a number of issues, and among them was the question of Are governmental programs good? Should the government be involved? What do we do in terms of job creation? What benefits do we give to people? Some of the same questions that are coming up today, although I think that today the Tea Party has raised some issues in a certain way, which are, I think there's a tremendous fight right now for America's soul in terms of where we're going with some of our basic protections, such as Social Security, such as Medicare. I don't want to see these abridged, and I think the notion that private concerns can take care of them, or stocks and bonds can take care of them, is not my belief.
Well, it looks like we're down to our time limit. We got there. Is there anything you want to leave with the audience?
Well, just to say that I think we are lucky to be in Westchester County. It's a great county, and I think that the 2012 and the initiative that we heard in the State of the Union last night, I think we're going to be coming back from where we are in terms of this recession, and I hope that the results of the next election will be a very important one in terms of the role of government. And I see government as helpful and important to the people.
Okay, so we need to get out and vote. Okay, well, thank you for watching. I just want to shout out to my brothers down in Charlottesville, Virginia. We were down there for New Year's Eve, and we had a great time with the brothers. And again, thank you, Omega Psi Phi fraternity, for welcoming us as brothers down in Charlottesville. And I want to thank you, Counselor,
thank you.
For being here.
Mr. Burris.
And thank you for watching. Peace and God bless.